we also have
L'avete ricevuto Gabriella e
Raissa.
E Laura? Laura e Gabriella, tutto a posto? Ok.
Inglese, mi senti Elena? Ok.
Dominique, you are there? Dominique, est-ce que vous êtes là? Je l'ai vu pour un instant. On voulait juste tester le micro, la caméra. Voilà. Thanks. Merci bien. On vous entend pas là, hein? On vous entend pas? Et aussi, c'est un peu loin. Bon. Peut-être que vous pour résumer un peu. Good morning, Renate.
Mirella, sì, ne mando un altro.
Everybody.
Sì.
So the link works perfect.
Questa Annaelle Lancelot.
Oh, that's good. That's good. Yeah, we also see you very well. Maybe Renate, your voice will later on when you speak, you can put your volume slightly higher. That would be nice. Let's try again.
Yes. Yes. Okay.
That's
Is
better.
that better?
Better.
Yeah.
Also, would like to see with Raissa and Dominique. Okay. Thanks for coming to test. The person who is testing for Dominique Lambert, we see you very far away. On vous voit très loin. Yeah, encore un peu, encore un peu. Et c'est un peu déplacé, c'est pas signe très. Et on vous entend pas. Hein. Vous n'êtes pas muté, mais les micros, c'est pas les bons, je pense.
Ne manca un sacco.
Monica, est-ce que je vous laisse commencer avec les infos pratiques ou je les donne moi-même?
Comme vous voulez, peut-être que ça, je peux le faire.
Donc, la traduction, QR, chat, les rapports visuels. Et puis après, moi, je commencerai par donner un petit rappel de ce qui s'est passé hier.
Ok, mais on fait le même hier. Hein. C'est vous qui commence et vous me passez la parole, c'est bien?
Très bien, parfait.
Ok, comme ça, il balance ses bons noms d'abord.
Oui, de l'OCD, j'en fais un dernier essai. Vous nous entendez?
Oui, c'était Dominique.
Parfait, merci.
Oui. We didn't manage to do the testing. Maria, hi, thanks for coming. Do you hear me well? Can we test your micro?
Good morning, everyone. Good to be with you.
Recording in progress.
That's good. We just miss Raissa. They were there for a second and they went away. Let's see if they come back for a moment. Miss Raissa, are you there? Is there anyone for Miss Raissa? Est-ce qu'il y a quelqu'un pour Madame Raissa?
Non, en fait, elle est en ligne, mais elle n'est pas branchée.
Oui, je l'ai vu en instant. Hi Timothy, good morning, thanks for coming. Would you mind to quickly test your mic?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, perfect. Sounding clear. Great. Okay, so we have to open. Madame Raïs, on n'a pas arrivé à faire le test. Peut-être on peut le faire. Oui, on va pouvoir le faire pendant la pause. Et je pense qu'il faut commencer bientôt. Donc là, le webinaire s'est ouvert aux participants. On a déjà 17 personnes. On va mettre la musique pendant qu'ils rentrent. Je vais vous demander de vous muter. I'm going to ask you to mute yourself while they come in. And then at 9:30, we give the floor to Anusha. Anusha will open the day. Thanks.
Toutes et à tous.
Good morning, all. Welcome to this second video conference in zero tolerance for child labor and human trafficking. You are still numerous. It has been extremely enriching. Some come from this from the first day, and that we participants and speakers of day two later of these two
different interventions that you can exchange your recommendation, your documents, your links, your resources in the chat. While which is just on the right toolbar, and you find the icon just at the bottom of the screen. Next to the icon chat, you will see another icon, which is Q&A in French and Q&A in English. There you can write your questions. By the way, you have noticed I'm speaking in English. This webinar was meant to be in the two languages, and we have simultaneous interpretation. So make sure you click on the small globe at the bottom of your screen and select the channel French. Ça, je vais le dire aussi en français, parce que peut-être, si vous ne comprenez pas l'anglais, vous n'avez pas encore choisi les canaux de la traduction, vous n'avez pas pu me comprendre. À la base, au fond de l'écran, vous allez voir un petit globe, et là, vous devez cliquer pour voir les canaux FR français. Vous les cliquez et vous pouvez écouter tout ce que je dis et que les autres intervenants vont dire en anglais, vous pouvez l'écouter en français. Les mêmes the same for the English speakers, of course. If you want to listen to English and somebody speaking in French, just click on English. Maintenant que tout le monde connaît comment gérer l'interprétariat et comment...
Now that you are all able to follow interpretation and listen to your preferred language, I will repeat this also in English. It's important that you can use the chat box or the Q&A function.
Doubts, please write in the chat. If the interpretation doesn't work for you, write in the chat. I can see that there is someone, for example, among the attendees that has the hands raised. In that case, if you have a question, please write it in the Q&A. And if you have a comment, write it in the chat. The other information I would like to give you is about the recordings. Yesterday, as I said, we had a very interesting exchange, and it has all been recorded. You will be receiving an email with the link with the page to access in order to access the French and the English recordings. And the same for today. Finally, I would like you to know that we are preparing a report on whatever has been exchanged so far and will be exchanged today. But also at the end of each session, we have a visual report. Somebody is capturing the highlights, the major ideas, the key concepts that are exchanged in a visual report. And that will also be downloadable from the chat. That's it. I hope that we are going to have, I'm pretty sure actually that we are going to have a very interesting day. Anousheh, back to you.
Merci beaucoup, Monica.
Thank you very much, Monica, for these very precious information. I just would like to summarize very briefly what has been said yesterday, a high-level session with 8 ministries of Pathfinder countries: Albania, Germany, France, Cote d'Ivoire, and the Netherlands, who renewed with their commitment, their political commitment with regard to the fight against child labor, forced labor, and human trafficking. The European Commissioner was from Brussels. Will also underline the joining of Alliance 8.7 in the coming days. The first session was included organizers and co-organizers that were linked by the words of the victims and projects, people involved in important projects. We had good chances of good reasons to be optimistic, to make progresses, to eliminate this plague that we are fighting through actions in the ground. We also see at which point all the speakers underlined the relevance of having a national legislation, the compliance with international treaties, as well as the role and the shared participation with industrialized countries and developing countries, producing and consuming countries, with all the stakeholders, and the key role of civil society and social partners, employers and workers organizations and enterprises, in order to succeed in eradicating child labor, forced labor. Finally, we heard in the first session, we talked about in the first session on the prevention along global supply chains. So the International Employers Organization, the International Trade Union Confederation, university representatives who talked about the fundamental keys of the deep causes, of the root causes of child labor and forced labor that we have to fight in order to eradicate them. We also had quite interesting discussions on how we can give more responsibility to enterprises by the devoir on the due diligence, and how to provide a transparency framework to enterprises. And this idea of of focusing on human rights, and you've used working at the indicators and the measurables, measurable criteria specific to each criteria, the sector of activity, in order to evaluate the progresses. Then there's been a presentation from civil society, from associations from civil societies, on how they conduct their work in terms of flagging out and requires cases and requiring punishments, as well as awareness raising among the public and public opinion on these issues. Finally, we had a session on the issue of detection, identification, and protection of victims. And here we've seen that all countries are implementing measures. They learn from one another, and that is, and that they base their work of identification and detection identification on the work of associations on the ground. And we've seen to which point we need expertise and knowledge and research in order to better understand the phenomenon underway, the victims, as well as the perpetrators, in order to fight them. We also heard an interesting idea that is the intervention of the person in charge of International Cocoa Initiative, which who invited us to have a more an approach towards child labor, and a stronger approach with regard to human trafficking, which is a criminal act, and maybe we can be softer with regard to child labor. Now we are going to start our session number 3, which is entitled leading an ambitious and effective action in Europe and in the world. So by strengthening European tools to tackle the root causes, which are the lack of social protection, poverty, violence, and so your proposals, the proposal of the speakers and raw reaction, ladies and gentlemen and participants, will have a special relevance, because today we see that there are conflicts around the world, armed conflicts, and now at the doorstep of Europe are throwing hundreds of women, children, and men making to the in exile, and they make them even more vulnerable to exploitation, sexual exploitation, which are the causes that we fight in since we wanted to eradicate child labor, forced labor, and human trafficking. So I open the session, and I give the floor to Martha Newton, Deputy General Manager of the International Labour Organization, Renate Orlung-Draus, Vice President of the ILO governing body, Chair of the Employers Group, Kathleen Paskir, Vice President of the ILO governing body, Chair of Workers Group. And so I give you 3 ladies the floor. Martha, the floor is yours. We cannot hear you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the opportunity to join day 2 of this important event focused on how we can, and I will say how we must deepen our collaboration for the fight against child labor, forced labor, and human trafficking. And I specifically want to thank you, Anashe, for your invitation and for France's leadership on this issue. I'm also very honored to be joined by 2 leading voices in the ILO, Kathleen Paskir, Vice President of the ILO governing body and Chairperson of the Workers Group, and Renata Orlung-Draus, the Vice President of the governing body and Chairperson of the Employers Group. So forced labor and human trafficking, as we all know, and you probably heard many times yesterday, remains tragically common in today's global economy. our estimates, which were last done in 2016. So from our last official data in 2016, there were nearly 25 men, women, and children at that point worldwide who were forced to work against their will and under threat. And of this, 21 million in privately imposed forced labor and 4 million in state imposed forced labor. And 4.3 million of those individuals were children, and 15.6 were women and girls. And I'm excited that very soon, here in a few months, we're going to be releasing our new estimates on forced labor. And although we're finalizing the report, I will remind you all that when the ILO released our child labor estimates earlier last year, for the first time in 20 years, we saw a reverse trend. And this is really, really troubling. But half of the persons today, I'll go back to forced labor, are in the private economy, where it's situations of debt bondage. And today's bonded labor is associated in an important part with coercive practices, including exorbitant fees in the private recruitment industry, just really predatory behavior, quite frankly. But there's also older and more deeply ingrained forms of debt bondage, and sometimes intergenerational bondage also persists. And I should also highlight that the victims of forced labor in the private economy around the world generate approximately 150 billion per year in illicit profits. And our research shows that forced labor is not an issue solely for developing economies. Profits from the forced labor industry are higher in developed economies. And I'm sure you spoke to this yesterday, and higher in the European Union than anywhere else in the world. So responding to forced labor and the fact of having this gathering and convening to really look at appropriate policy choices is really critical. So with regards to the ILO tools, the forced labor instruments, conventions conventions number 29 and 105, as well as the protocol to convention number 29 and recommendation 203, coupled with relevant international instruments, provide key guidance in this regard. And these instruments highlight that forced labor, slavery, and human trafficking are serious crimes, and they need to be dealt with as such. But they also make it clear that these abuses alone cannot be eliminated just through criminal law enforcement. We have to have broad-based approaches with strong emphasis on protection, prevention, and remedies in addition to enforcement, and really underpinned by strengthened international cooperation and social dialogue, which is what this key high-level event represents. So I just want to talk a little bit about some of the drivers. Forced labor thrives, as you all know, in an incubator of poverty and vulnerability, low levels of education and literacy, and as Anashe has alluded, precarious migration. Just look at our world the last week alone. And women and girls in particular are subject to forced commercial sexual exploitation. So many stories when I walked along survivors. Earlier in my career, for many years, I was in the criminal justice system working directly with violent crime victims. And as I walked these individuals, and I say survivors, because it's important to give a voice to these individuals. So I always I've said victims, but I like to say survivors. Walking along survivors through the criminal justice system, where many of them, most of them, were young women preyed upon under the guise of legitimate work opportunities. They just wanted an opportunity to make their lives better. So there's many other root causes of forced labor and human trafficking. There's informality, the lack of access to social protection, just weak governance structures, discrimination, just crises, as has been alluded to, and low awareness of what someone's labor and human rights are. So solutions that address these factors have to be a part of creating sustainable change. And also, since we have the employers represented today, we've seen that business and companies' efforts to eradicate these human rights violations have come a long way in recent years. And I know that coupled with ILO efforts to address root causes, it can go even further. So just the importance of using the ILO conventions, protocols, and recommendations to increase knowledge and awareness and the ratifications of ILO protocols and recommendations. I think the 50 for Freedom campaign is a definitive example that's been led by ILO and our partners at around this table today, specifically the International Trade Union Confederation and the International Organization of Employers. We now have over 50 ratifications of Protocol 29. And it's really important that we talk about using all the tools in our toolkit. And when it comes to the ILO, that toolkit is the ILO supervisory system. And I like to give an example of Qatar, because to me, it represents how we used all the tools in our toolkit, from a complaint against the state of Qatar to a comprehensive labor rights program and the opening of a project office, to the dismantlement of kafala, establishment of a non-discriminatory minimum wage. It's not to say things are perfect in Qatar yet, but being able to use the tools that are available have been able to help move the needle. And this was all done in full coordination and collaboration with the Trade Union Confederation and the International Organization of Employers, as well as member states. And when you hold governments accountable and make sure that social dialogue underpins efforts to work with countries, and where we have tangible examples like Qatar, again, we can show that working together, we can move the needle. And I just want to stress briefly about the importance of national policies and action plans and addressing legislation. Working closely with our constituents to improve and
travailler étroitement avec les mandants pour améliorer les politiques nationales et les plans basés sur les preuves. Je voudrais vous donner des exemples. En Irlande, le plan national sur la traite peut soutenir depuis 2016 les survivants de la traite d'êtres humains, les professionnels des forces de l'ordre, de la santé, de l'éducation, la société civile, mais aussi les agences l'application, chargées de l'application de la loi dans d'autres juridictions, et y compris les leaders religieux. Il s'agit d'une approche holistique et complète qui a été
organizations, judicial authorities and health and social services, teachers and education services. That's an important one that often doesn't get talked about. And again, community, religious leaders, and even volunteers. And I know you spoke, Anashe, about a little bit about COCO strategies, and I didn't get to hear the full conversation yesterday, but I'll use the example of Côte d'Ivoire. When developing its national action plan, it carried out extensive consultations with appropriate authorities, with the social partners, as well as the civil society, to make sure that there was ownership of this national action plan. And the thing I liked about this one is all relevant actors were also involved when deciding on the budget and making it precise and comprehensive. And as a result, the NAP presents a cost breakdown by goal, by activity, by year, and expressly identifies the financing source for each. And having been involved since the development stage, the partners were able to assess their investment capacities. So I know my time is limited. Again, one thing I wanted to mention, in addition to our new estimates of forced labor that will be coming out, we're also going to have a new report on the costs of forced labor. And this is important because you have to be able to make the business case for why, and addressing is an important political message to make the business case. So, you know, we're dealing with capitals and governments around the world who have many pressing priorities, and it's important and strategic to do this. So I look forward to sharing that new report with you all. Again, I could go on, but I've heard the bell. I just want to also, obviously, Alliance 8.7, it's a definitive global partnership, and really encourage everyone to be involved in Alliance 8.7, to continue to spread the word about 8.7, just fair recruitment, you know, I'm sure it will be discussed today, but the fair recruitment strategy of the ILO is so important. And for anybody on this, happy to give you specific information about how fair recruitment as a capacity building program it can support your efforts. So I really look forward to hearing today about how we can strategize together and lead ambitious and effective action for Europe and for the world, about what we can do today, and again, what we must do today to help get to zero tolerance together. So thank you so much for having me, Anousheh, and look forward to the discussion. Over.
Merci beaucoup, chère Martha, pour cette première intervention.
Thank you very much, dear Martha. I would like to give the floor to Renate. You have a green lawn behind you. Good morning.
This is an important opportunity to prepare for the 5th Global Conference on Child Labor next May in Durban. I would like to focus my intervention on preparing this conference because it is important that Durban becomes a success. We must do everything possible to reverse the trend of the increase in child labor, which we unfortunately have seen in the last estimates of child labor. Since the foundation of the ILO, child labor has been a core issue for the organization, and Martha has stressed this. It is very appropriate to open this panel on future action with the ILO leadership and the social partners. So I commend you for this, dear Anousheh, because I think social partners play a very important role along with the ILO and of course the governments. There's no doubt that the ILO will play a key role in supporting member states in the implementation of the action plan, which will come out of Durban. The ILO has a very successful target programs to tackle child labor. I would like to congratulate the ILO, particularly fundamentals, to the great work they are doing. However, as Martha also said, rightly so, at the end of the day, it is the cooperation of the different ILO departments and programs which will make the difference. Because as has been stressed by many speakers yesterday and by Martha just now, if we want to make progress in the eradication of child and forced labor, we need to address the root causes. And these are informality, limited access to education, lack of social protection, insufficient labor inspection. This means that the ILO governance department, the enterprise department, the social protection flagship program, the gender and diversity branch, as well as the migration branch, the employment departments, the social dialogue experts, they all have a key role to play. Through the so-called One ILO approach, we will be able to change the reality on the ground. There have been many efforts in the organization to break down silos, but there is still room for improvement. This must continue to be a priority. At the last Global Child Labor Conference in Buenos Aires 5 years ago, we set up the Alliance 8.7. This Alliance 8.7 brings together UN organizations, governments, social partners, and civil society at international and national level. The Alliance has a tremendous convening power, and it is connecting the dots between international and national and the social partner levels. I would like to thank you, Anousheh, for your leadership in the Alliance, and the ILO, particularly Thomas Wissing, for organizing the Alliance. It is this kind of innovative approaches which is triggering collective action that we should focus on. I would strongly advocate to further strengthen the Alliance 8.7, the ongoing efforts for monitoring progress and Pathfinder efforts, the peer learning between Pathfinder countries, the coordination in research and capacity building are important cornerstones in this regard. What we can achieve through this kind of collective action, we have seen in Qatar, Martha mentioned that already, but also in Uzbekistan, some years earlier, where under the stewardship of the ILO and strong engagement of the national social partners and the national governments, were successfully eradicating child labor and forced labor. It is these kinds of successes which we need to not only celebrate, but also to replicate. And I think one important element here is that it has not been done above and over the heads of the national actors, but together with them, because this is the precondition for really triggering lasting and sustainable change. The draft EU supply chain directive has received much attention and has been also often referred to in this conference. I will not discuss in detail the pros and cons of the different provisions of this draft directive. There's also no question that due diligence is a fundamental part of corporate responsibility to respect human rights under the UN guiding principles. However, mandatory due diligence is not the silver bullet to eradicate child or forced labor. Not only does the vast majority of child and forced labor occur in the purely domestic economy, as could be seen from the report of the Alliance 8.7, but also an individual company alone will not be able to address deep-rooted systemic challenges deep down in the supply chains. Dorothy Baumann-Pauli stressed yesterday that due diligence will address only the symptoms, but not the root causes. Every patient who is under pain knows that treating the symptoms is important, but that at the end of the day, we need to cure the illness. Companies, particularly medium-sized companies, will need support in their due diligence. The IOE, together with the ILO, developed important guidance on child and forced labor, which is even referenced in the Dutch and Swiss child labor due diligence laws. However, what is missing are practical information on specific country risks, relevant stakeholders at local level, possible partners for collective action. My colleague Matthias Torns spoke yesterday already about the important role employer federations can play in this regard. And he also mentioned the Global Help Desk initiative on which the IOE is working. We encourage Alliance 8.7 partners and governments to support this initiative. Colleagues, in Buenos Aires, we have seen many pledges from many different stakeholders. We need to see where we stand with their implementation. This is not about blaming and shaming organizations and governments for not delivering, but it is about getting a better understanding on what has worked and what has not worked and why it has not worked. These insights are critical if we want to improve interventions. It would be great if there could be a chance to have an overview before Durban on this, so that our discussion in Durban could be also guided by this evaluation of the implementation of pledges. One big challenge we face is policy coherence at international level, and of course also at national level. But I will focus on the international level here. Responsible business conduct in supply chains is a key priority for the German G7 presidency. I hope that the German G7 labor ministerial meeting, which will take place the very day after the closing of the Global Conference on Child Labor in Durban, will take fully on board the Durban Action Plan. At the end of the day, we need to ensure that there is proper follow-up at national level to our work in Durban, and that the G7 can reinforce and trigger action in this regard. Similarly, the Indonesian G20 should see in how far they can take the Durban Action Plan into account in their work, as B20 and L20 employers and workers will push for this. Colleagues, we live in uncertain times and difficult, complex constellations. The pandemic has already deeply impacted the occurrence of child and forced labor, and unfortunately in a very negative sense. I fear that the geopolitical tensions we see at the moment additionally increase the danger of this. This must not happen. We must all work to restore cooperation, trust at the international level between all the nations, so that we can also address the root causes of child and forced labor. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, Renate. Je donne tout de suite la parole à Kathleen Pesquia. Kathleen, la parole est à vous.
I give the floor to Catherine.
Merci beaucoup, Anousheh. And good morning to my ILO colleagues in this panel, Martha and Renate. And thanks very much.
Merci beaucoup, Anousheh. Bonjour, chers collègues. Merci de m'avoir invité à participer à ce forum de très haut niveau. Permettez-moi de dire d'emblée que l'Alliance 8.7 se penche sur ces fléaux qui sont le travail forcé, le travail des enfants et la traite d'êtres humains, des fléaux qui doivent être éradiqués. C'est une question urgente. Donc, cela demande des réponses ciblées. Nous devons prioriser le travail des enfants car il persiste dans l'agriculture, il sévit dans l'agriculture. On voit également que des enfants âgés de 5 à 10 ans effectuent des tâches dans le secteur de l'agriculture qui sont effectuées par la plupart du temps dans le domaine familial. Il y a d'autres causes, la protection sociale et le fossé qui se creuse dans les inégalités. Avec la pandémie, on assiste également à une inégalité d'accès aux vaccins. Donc, il est important de considérer également les causes profondes de l'exploitation à des fins de travail. Car on observe des violations constantes des droits au travail, de la négociation collective. Cela donc montre également que les travailleurs migrants sont les plus vulnérables aux exploitations. Il y a une précarité, une insécurité de travail, un manque de négociation collective, de pouvoir de négociation collective qui doit être également considéré comme une cause d'exploitation. Et la pandémie a frappé de plein fouet les plus vulnérables, les travailleurs les plus vulnérables. Et donc, les Nations Unies ont déclaré l'année 2021 comme l'année pour éliminer le travail des enfants. Mais malheureusement, on voit une hausse du travail des enfants dans cette année. La réduction de la production, l'augmentation du chômage, le peu d'accès à la sécurité sociale ont favorisé cette hausse du travail des enfants. On voit que dans les pays les plus pauvres, le chef de famille se trouve dans une situation de travail informelle. Et donc, parfois, les familles sont forcées au travail des enfants, qui est une source de revenus pour la famille. La pandémie a causé la fermeture des établissements scolaires. Plusieurs enfants ont été retirés de l'école. Le gouvernement de l'Afrique du Sud va accueillir la conférence au mois de mai et nous saluons cette conférence dans ce pays car elle sera.
For trade unions, a new social contract centered on the Sustainable Development Goal 8 is the central building stone for a human-centered recovery. To tackle child labor, we need to have a holistic approach to decent employment creation for adults. This also includes living wages. There are clear links between adult unemployment and underemployment with poor wages and growing child labor practices. More often than not, parents without decent jobs and incomes recruit their children as additional hands to shore up household incomes. The vast majority of child labor, as I said, can be found in agriculture, where most work is informal, labor inspection is often non-existent, fundamental rights are denied, and wages and working conditions frequently terrible. Targeted efforts from governments are urgently needed to promote inclusive rural development through the promotion of decent work in agriculture and the expansion of the scope of services provided by the state, such as accessible and quality healthcare and schooling. Trade unions have a key role to play
to identify where there is child labor and to contribute to the solutions, as they need to include good working conditions for the adults. There is a lot of evidence to show that in workplaces where workers are organized, there is no child labor. Therefore, we must focus attention and energy on lifting restrictions and obstacles to freedom of association and organizing, including for workers in the informal economy and precarious jobs. Child labor is primarily a development problem. The elimination of child labor requires a rights-based approach, decent jobs for adults, social protection, quality public services, but also access to land rights, credit, and collective bargaining power to negotiate a proper price for one's products. And last but not least, a serious long-term engagement. Through its targets for jobs, workers' protection, decent work, social protection, inclusive growth, and environmental preservation, SDG 8 connects social and economic progress, providing strong leverage for achieving the other goals of the 2030 agenda, making SDG 8 an enabling goal. The pandemic also shows the need to strengthen national responses and to improve multilateral efforts of the international community on universal access to social protection, quality public services, and the protection of human rights and labor rights, as well as safe and legal pathways for migration and gender equality. As the recent conclusions of the ILC on inequalities recognize, there is a need for global cooperation and solidarity, and I quote, "Poorer countries risk being left behind for decades to come because of pre-existing structural weaknesses in their economies and lack of fiscal space required to foster recovery from COVID-19, among others. Some are being seriously constrained by chronic debt, which has grown larger during the pandemic, as they are channeling a higher share of national revenues into debt service, reducing funding for social economic development." End of quote. That is why promoting universal social protection and ensuring social protection floors is crucial, with the establishment of a global fund for social protection as an urgent first step to avoid a surge in child labor in developing countries. In last week's ILO Global Policy Forum, many speakers supported this as an urgent priority for the ILO and its international partners. In addition, the 14 remaining governments that have not ratified ILO Convention 138 on the minimum age should do so this year, and all governments should resolve not to allow the world to slide back into 19th century exploitation. Alliance 8.7, coordinated under the auspices of the ILO with its tripartite constituents, but also a broad range of institutional and non-governmental partners, is a prime vehicle and opportunity to coordinate such multilateral efforts. We encourage all parties to consider the key role freedom of association and collective bargaining as enabling rights for decent working conditions for adults. And I'm grateful for the reference in the introduction to this panel to the importance of assessing progress in implementation by periodical and efficient monitoring. The Alliance's monitoring system is linked to the broader machinery of the ILO and the UN supervisory systems, allowing independent and objective monitoring and expert recommendations for further action. Let me now turn briefly to forced labor and modern slavery and address some challenges in the European region. During the COVID crisis, the many vulnerabilities of the migrant workers in abusive working conditions and horrific housing facilities came to the surface and were publicly exposed and addressed by unions in several countries. That led to an increased awareness and understanding that the position of migrant workers urgently needs to be improved. But we still have a long way to go. Labor exploitation and human trafficking is still thriving in parallel worlds in greenhouses, warehouses, slaughterhouses, and on parking lots for truckers. The lack of enforcement of fundamental rights and protection for workers is devastating, not only for victims, but also for companies and sectors. Companies in the supply chains hiring, contracting, or subcontracting workers have to guarantee safe, fair, and sustainable working conditions. We need responsible, sustainable enterprises that have the market power to create a better, more sustainable model for fair working conditions. So we need better regulation indeed on global supply chains and due diligence. The ILO protocol on forced labor, despite EU-wide enforcement, needs to still be ratified by many more European governments. But that will in itself not be enough. As the pandemic has exposed the world's dependence on the well-functioning of global supply chains to provide for essential goods and services, we really need to address the fact that 94% of the global workforce is a hidden workforce in global supply chains, where the obscurity of business contracts facilitates exploitation and oppression. For us as trade unions, it's clear that decades of voluntary corporate social initiatives have failed to have any significant impact on the reality of workers, quite the contrary. It's crucial that human rights due diligence throughout global supply chains is now made mandatory by governments for multinational companies headquartered in their territory, at the UN and ILO through binding conventions, and indeed in the EU through its directive on corporate sustainability due diligence.
Kathleen, you must conclude now.
Yes, I will conclude if you allow me. Although we welcome this directive as an important step, we think that it must be further improved to offer real protection to victims and rights holders and include involvement of workers and trade unions in shaping and monitoring sustainable businesses. There will be more discussion on this today. To conclude, in the recent ILC discussion at the ILO on inequalities and the world of work, it was recognized that there is a global inequality crisis with private wealth accumulation going through the roof that is putting at risk the very aims of the Philadelphia Declaration. Adult workers should be able to live from the work they produce. The value added that they create and the society value of labor should translate into living wages for themselves and their families. The alarming levels of working poverty and of those in insecure forms of work without any social and labor protection and without enough money to make ends meet show that the social contract is broken, and this leaves an open space for increasing child labor and labor exploitation, deepening inequalities for present and future generations. It is our solemn and moral obligation to engage in renewing this social contract based on social and environmental justice, for social peace, for the world of work of today and tomorrow. And I thank you very much also for allowing me to finish my speech this morning. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kathleen. Nous avions 3 interventions très intéressantes. La première sur l'importance de la.
So we had the importance of ratification of convention, ratification of the ILO and all of the international instruments which are at our disposal in order to have a supervisory system in order to ensure its implementation. The very important issue of the consistency of our messages at the International International Conference of Durban for the Eradication of Child Labor of G7 and G20 as well. Another important element, the objective 8 of sustainable development as a whole. The unit 8.7 is only part of the targets and the objective to be achieved. We have to move forward with all of these objectives at the same time. And so subsistence wage is key. I give the floor now to the next speaker, and apologize for the delay. Diane Schmidt, she's the EU anti-trafficking coordinator of the European Commission, General Dominique Lambert, Central Office to counter illegal employment in France, Cécile Billot, Head of Unit, Directorate General for International Partnership of the European Commission. Now the floor is yours. Before giving you the floor, I also would like to remind you that this conference could always have been organized thanks to the support of our coordinator, the National Consultative French Commissioner of Human Rights on the fight against child human trafficking, France Catholique against the human trafficking, and the Committee Against the Modern Slavery. Thanks to these organizations for helping us in coordinating and supporting us in the organization of this event. Madame Dimesweet, the floor is yours. Good morning to all the participants. I would like to thank all the organizers of this conference, which has been who have been named. I will not name them specifically because it would take too much time, but I've seen during the yesterday and then this morning, seen very familiar faces who are very useful in the fight against human trafficking. Speaking of child labor, forced labor, and human trafficking at European and global level is necessary and relevant. The involvement of the private sector and civil society is also key. We are in partnership. Only in partnership we can prevent this problem and stop these criminals. Let me give you a few figures. In the European Union, 1 victim out of 4 is a child, and among children victims of trafficking, 64% are exploited for sexual purpose and the others for forced labor. 15% of victims are exploited at work, and among these 15%, 10% are children. These percentages show that even within the EU, children are exploited at work, and more victims are not even detected. This is why not only at the global level, but also at the European and national and regional level, an approach of zero tolerance is necessary in order to avoid that trafficking is hidden in services, and that the human beings are exploited, deprived of their dignity and freedom. As you know, the European Commission presented in April last year a European strategy for the fight against human trafficking. That strategy involves 4 key objectives, which are at the root of our action to fight against forced labor. We have to reduce the demand feeding human trafficking. Secondly, break the economic model of trafficking, even online. Third, protect and support the victims, in particular children and women. And fourth, cooperate at international level. Victims, regardless of the form of trafficking, are and will remain at the heart of our concerns, and especially children. We have different means to fight against human trafficking and forced labor, and these have political and juridical forms, operational and financial forms. I will limit myself to mention a few points since we don't have much time. First of all, the European legislation. The directive concerning prevention and fight against human trafficking, as well as the protection of victims, is an horizontal tool, a very important one, defining the crime based on international convention and establishing criminal sanctions and the pursuit of victims, of perpetrators, and the protection of victims. We have evaluated this legislation in view of a possible amendment. Furthermore, we envisage the possibility of making mandatory the impossibility of using use of services using people involved that have been trafficked. With the pandemic, exploitation is online. People are recruited online by criminals, promising well-remunerated jobs. They are exploited online. Their transportation, housing, they are organized online. Money is washed online and laundered online. So the European Commission for the future of this directive will be happy to receive the contribution of the participants of this conference if they are interested. This consultation is open till March 9th. The Commission recently presented a work on a number of other initiatives. One of these initiatives, a recent initiative, and many of you evoked it, we took note of the comments, is the promotion, the due diligence of enterprises, which is currently on the table of the Council of the European Parliament. So we need to find an agreement on the final text. Once adopted and implemented by member states, this new European legislation will contribute to prevent, put an end to child labor and exploitation of workers. The Commission is also preparing a new legislative instrument to prevent the entry on the EU market of products produced with forced labor. As it had been said earlier, the legislation cannot remedy to all. Employers and enterprises play a very important role, as well as labor inspectors who can identify forms of exploitation. And in the framework of prevention and detection, we have the adoption of campaigns, awareness-raising campaign of the risk of human trafficking. We encourage member states to do the same thing. The objective is to target the sectors which are at high risk, as agriculture, assembly chains, factories, construction, hotels and accommodation, households, and so on. The numerical dimension of these forms also forces us to involve the private sector as well. It's in with regard to adults, it's not easy to identify the content of online human trafficking. And then from an operational standpoint, these brought concrete actions in identifying victims and traffickers. The police forces and agency of the EU and courts and tribunals should work together. Many victims have been identified in Italy following a work conducted by Moldavian and Italian police forces. The criminal group was recruiting Moldavian women and transported to Italy with a touristic visa and used to work in households and domestic work. A cooperation within Europol and European authorities supported an action conducted by France with Bulgarian authority, Cyprus and Spain and authorities, arrests that led to arrests and the identification of about 50 traffickers and about 200 victims in the agricultural sector. This cross-border collaboration with also the countries of origin of the victims is very relevant. It will continue. What is less satisfactory is the weak number of prosecution against the traffickers and a few condemnations. Human trafficking is still a very lucrative business with low risk, and this should change. Cooperation between transborder forces and organizations, legislations, and so on are aspects that needs improvement. In this context, the seizure of the traffickers' assets is another important aspect. Thank you very much, Diane. I have to just stop by saying what is happening in Ukraine. Ukraine, many people are leaving the country because of the war, women and children. We know that the people leaving because of the war, leaving the country because of the war, are at risk, are particularly vulnerable. And this vulnerability is exploited by criminals. Once arrived, where these people arrive at destination, non-accompanied, the children are particularly exposed, but they're the only one. So it is a key to follow attentively what is happening at our borders. This is the first point. Secondly, what is important to prevent, to draw the attention of people arriving, especially children and women, on the risks related to trafficking. And the awareness raising campaign must be conducted right away, immediately. Third, it is important to quickly identify potential victims and to ensure their protection. And fourth, it is important to share with the responsible authorities information on the criminal networks. As well as we know, today, under the presidency of the Ministry of the French Ministry of the Interior, the ministries are organizing within the Council to discuss a proposal of the Commission to give temporary protection to people leaving Ukraine. This protection will allow to give stability to these people, limit the risk of exploitation, including forced labor. According to the data that we have dating 2018, Ukrainian citizens were among the first nationalities among the victims originating from non-EU countries. We already had a problem in the past, and this is related to forced labor, to sexual exploitation. So we need to be vigilant, and we need to apply all the possible measures required for this war at our borders will not increases the number of victims of the traffic. I apologize for taking too much time, and apologies for taking too much time. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much. You have demonstrated that the legislation is important, but it is not the only instruments we have. You may focus on Ukraine, and I give now the word to General Lambert. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for giving me the floor. I'm General Lambert from the General Bureau in France, which is the contact point for the international police cooperation on these different issues. I'd like to stick to the time to speak about this very rich topic. There is the European cooperation with the police forces. At European level, we have Europol, and I will speak about operational aspects. You know about Europol, the European Police Agency, which is made of members dispatched by the member states. Europol regularly assesses the threats on the European Union and identifies in the different studies the human trafficking in human beings as one of the aspects in the European Union. For example, sexual exploitation and exploitation in the workplace in the European Union. After these studies, they have defined human trafficking in human beings as one of the priority actions against a very serious threat. So operations are then implemented with the European multidisciplinary platform against the criminal threats. It's a forum that sets up priorities for the cycles 2018 and 2021 and 2021 and 2025. And now it collaborates with Europol. The idea is to set up synergies, practical synergies with the police forces, the law enforcement agencies, labor inspection, and the European Union agencies, the labor authority and other authorities, private and public organizations, third countries, to implement direct cooperation actions. The Netherlands and another association with France, Spain, Romania, and Austria have taken up this responsibility of implementing a series of actions on different plans, analysis of targeted topics, for example, trafficking in human beings in the agriculture sector, which is particularly at risk. Coordinated actions are also implemented during the joint action days, which means that we launch simultaneous checks in the European Union, joint actions, targeted actions in the agricultural sector, for example, in June and September. We launch coordinated controls and checks targeting sectors and then sharing the results. Also, we have a mapping twice a year on the trafficking of human beings in the territory of the European Union. These joint actions and checks also involve police and labor inspection agencies at level. Last year, during these two joint action sessions, we identified dozens of cases of trafficking in human beings. There are other actions in the framework of the impact program for preventing and reducing risks, supporting victims, and also on other topics such as money laundering and asset recovery. And we exchange information and also try to set up a budget for actions and coordinated operations. Europol focuses on the investigation on criminal side, investigations with criminal cases, and very quickly, if you could wrap up. So we have many actions on a strategic point of view. The definition of and the analysis of priorities, and on the operational side, we also consider to work in a network, and we want to develop a European culture. We also developed the practical tools to support the investigators, mainly in Eastern Europe, and we want to also help with the financing. I see that the trafficking in human beings is a topic that puts everyone together. We are all together. We have good contacts. We work together. We have set up contact networks, and I'm confident about the progress that we have made. There is a problem of the legal aspect. Thank you very much. I would like to give the floor to Silvio immediately. Please, Cécile.
Pour cette discussion très intéressante et l'organisation de cet événement.
Thank you very much. I will speak in English. Because there are many English-speaking participants, and I will provide a perspective of the European mission. Because I'm head of a unit in the international partnership. To begin with, I would like to confirm what others said before. the year 2022 is a very important year.
That, of course, last year was the year of international elimination in child labor, but we believe, and we also the figures, and colleagues from ILO referred to it earlier, we also the figures which are quite dramatic at global level, showing increase in terms of child labor in the world, especially if you look at a country in Africa and in certain sectors like agriculture, we see that child labor has not really been, the figures have not really been decreasing. On the opposite, in some cases have been increased, and the COVID situation has not really helped to push the fight against child labor. So we really think 2022 will be in continuation of last year, and this sort of very strong political engagement to work that with the Durban conference taking place, with on our side the EU joining the Alliance 8.7. Our commissioner, you referred to it, Danushek Leinen, announced it yesterday during the conference also, and also a number of very important policy legislative initiatives that we have taken at EU level, and they can refer to it. And this policy initiative have a very strong international dimension too. We really want to capitalize on 2021 and try to come with really some action in this year, 2022, as we are all meeting in Durban and putting forces together. We start also from the international dimension that I'm sharing a lot what the speaker have said and what is told generally, but it's always very good to recall it. It is a very complex issue. I mean, we all agree that we have to fight against it, child labor, forced labor, especially in supply chain. In third country, but it is not a sort of easy problem from a policy and regulatory perspective to deal with, because it is linked to very, very important and deep root causes that is not easy to address. And speakers have talked about the importance of living incomes, of social protection, which is really the basis, because if this exists, then of course parents wouldn't put their children at work, to put it blindly. I want also to stress the importance of basic education, because it is really a priority of our commissioner, Jutta Leinen. She has decided beginning of May to put 10% of the external funds that we have in the EU for international partnership to dedicate that to education, because if you put children back to school and have access to education, then of course it's a good thing for them to avoid child labor, and then but to have the skills on the longer term to be able to have decent job further down the road when they grow up and become adults. And in this respect, we wanted to mention this project that we do together with the ILO. We work on a lot of different projects with ILO and colleagues with ILO, but this one, the Clear Cotton project, has been really successful in working in the cotton supply chain in 4 countries, producing cotton, Burkina Faso, Pakistan, Mali, and really trying to move children from the fields and bring them to schools. And so far, we put this program into place. You can see already results with a number like 3,000 children, which have been already removed from working in the fields and have access to education. And this is this link, a typical project in a different, very specific sector that we believe we contribute to and work very, very strongly with our partner country to do more this year and in the next year coming up. Another important thing beyond education and the root causes is also that because this problem is so complex, we have to work really together in partnership of it. And I mean, the speaker also, the employer mentioned it. Working with the private sector, with employer, with the is very important. Again, in different light in different sector. We have worked also actively on the cocoa sector. You mentioned it, and that it was one of the sectors where child labor is and there is a lot of work going on. And we have dedicated multi-stakeholder initiative towards national funds and programs are taking place, and this is something we have done and we continue to do it. Now, just referring to what the EU also is doing for the policies, I'm not going to repeat what Diana said about the new proposal for directive on due diligence, just to say that it is really built also on the international dimension, also as a reference, of course, very important element in this field. And we will also put together accompanying measures and support, because in partner country, this means a lot of pragmatic, concrete implementation questions that our players need to put into place to be in conformity with it and to make sure that these diligence processes are a reality for them in this country. Last point I wanted to make also is the importance, because I think this hasn't been really talked during this panel, the importance of trade policy, our trade agreements that we have with the EU, also bilaterally, but also unilaterally via the General System Preference and GSP, plus especially system, because here we insist on strong implementation of ILO standard and convention. And trying to work together with our countries in the scheme so that they do progress into that and that they can get additional trade preference. So there is clearly an incentive there to work with them And it has a result already. If we look at Sri Lanka, for example, they've done a lot of work there to decrease the number of child labor. We will have also the review of the chapter, as we call it, the Trade and Sustainable Development chapter in our trade agreement. The review is currently ongoing to see how we can make them more effective and implementation more effective. So all to say that there are a number of EU initiatives there that are very important also to address the international aspect, and we'll be working in very proactively this year, and it's going to really be also the picture of what we are doing at the level, but really working with our partner community. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup à tous les trois. Vous nous avez tout aussi bien le cadre
Thank you much to all of you for this complete overview and of the actions undertaken by the European Union. We are a bit lagging behind, so without further ado, I would like to give the floor to the civil society for the roundtable on the actions led by the civil society. And we have Maria Niemann from Caritas Europe, Tim Ryan, Global March Against Child Labor, Martina Lipsch, Catholic Forum Living in Illegality, Germany, head of the working group against human trafficking human beings of the Episcopal Conference in Germany, and Karima Mkika, Association Al-Karam, Morocco. Mariam, what is yours? Thank you very much.
For this occasion. So I'm the Secretary General of Caritas Europa. Caritas is the second largest humanitarian organization in the world. And the European region has members in 46 countries. So our mission is to work with the people in the most poor and vulnerable situations across the world. At the European level, we mainly work to promote structural change through advocacy. This advocacy is built on the experience of the people who come to Caritas at the national level for support and services. We meet with people in situations of extreme poverty, and we bring their voices up to policymakers at the national level, which comes our members, but also at the European level in terms of Caritas Europa. And many of the people that we serve, they have faced exploitations. Many are victims of trafficking or of abuse. We see their realities firsthand, and we see the lack of adequate measures to prevent these crimes make to women and also to children, boys and girls. There are a number of root causes for exploitation, and we already discussed many of them, so I'll be very brief on this. There's the general exclusion from formal education for children and youth from disadvantaged backgrounds in particular, which often perpetuates a cycle of poverty. There is precarious work, such as informal work and non-standard employment, low wages. In work, poverty has increased over the last decade in most of the European Union member states. There is a lack of effective implementation of anti-trafficking legislation, and there is a lack of accountability of perpetrators. There is a lack of adequate legal channels to enter to the European Union. There are inequalities and discrimination, not least for women, power imbalances. I just mentioned a few. So what we're doing at the Caritas Europa level to try to tackle these root causes through advocacy and allowing for structural change. We advocate for social security systems that are worth their name, with a minimum income guarantee, minimum wage, access to health care, and access to social services such as Caritas, but also social services public and non-public. The European Union is currently discussing the minimum wage directive, and we call for its swift adoption. There's also an initiative now for a council recommendation on minimum income. That's being prepared right now by the European Commission, but we call for this to be a binding directive and not just a recommendation, because we need to ensure also that the same is true in our work on international development, that people have the possibility to build their lives in dignity within the communities that they live. I wanted also to make a special point concerning the situation in Ukraine and its humanitarian impact. We heard a little about this already. There's 1 million persons fleeing the country so far. Many more will follow. We heard of the huge risks that we need to be vigilant about to prevent situations of exploitation and abuse. Today, we hope the Temporary Protection Directive will be activated to allow proper protection and respect of the rights of the people fleeing home to Ukraine. This is being discussed as we speak now, and we call for this to be adopted. We have to ensure shelters and accommodation and services are provided to these people fleeing, ensuring the proper safeguards are put in place, as we just heard, to prevent any further exploitation and abuse. And also, independent from Ukraine, we have to support anyone in the protection, ensuring that they're safe and that rights are respected. I also want to make a point about the role of the European Union in ensuring a supply chain that is respectful of human rights. We all, mostly without being conscious of it, we contribute to exploitation due to the flawed supply chains and our consumption patterns. And now, new rules are proposed by the European Union. We also heard earlier about this, rules on due diligence, so checks along the full supply chain to prevent human rights abuses. But the current proposal on the table is inadequate and full of flaws and full of exemptions. The measures that are taken in the fields of trafficking and exploitation must be person-centered. They must also be victim-centered. Our response must allow for alternatives, ensuring really that life and dignity of people affected is possible. People must feel that there are safe alternatives, that there is a way out. This requires based on partnerships, and that's also happy about this discussion today. Only this will allow for rebuilding the lives of the victims and to prevent further people's lives broken. As the principle of non-punishment for victims is important, so that victims of human trafficking will feel to speak to investigators without fear or risk. So victim-centeredness throughout the process is key, and get the perspective right. Ensure that the victim are re-traumatized by the process and the consequences of the issues. So I think I'll stop my time is over. Thank you so much.
Merci beaucoup. Je termine avec des paroles fortes qu'il faut entendre sur le principe de non-punition et l'importance à ce que le processus de
on the principle of non-punishment and the possible that remediation has become a new traumatizing effect. Timothy Ryan, for this also, you represent Global March Against Child Labor, and maybe you can present a little bit your association, and you can speak further.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much to Madam Henry Carver, the Chair of Lands and the staff for organizing this event. The Global March Against Child Labor, and I personally appreciate the opportunity to address this program to participate in this third session on being ambitious and effective action in Europe and in the world. It's a cliche to say that the anti-child labor movement needs to consider where it's been in order to look forward to where it needs to go, but it's no less true. Governments, businesses, and societies need to consider where we can, what's working, what hasn't. That forms a baseline for a framework of standards and laws, which the European Union is now considering. 30 years ago, the situation of child labor was undeniably worse than it is now in terms of sheer numbers and percentage of the population in most regions. With house and months, child labor prevalence has decreased significantly during this time. Unfortunately, that progress came to an end prior to the COVID crisis, with an estimated 106 million children working as laborers, up 8.4 million from the previous years, and now exacerbated by COVID. But in the last 3 decades, we've seen first an overall reduction in child labor. Second, passage of ILO Convention 182 is the only university ratified ILO convention, and inclusion of child labor in national policy legal frameworks of many countries, though implementation certainly is lacking. Third, we've seen business sector initiatives such as the Cocoa Campaign, which have made progress but failed to really address root causes. And fourth, the application of practices such as school feed programs, cash transfer programs, child labor monitoring systems, area-based approaches, and emphasis on education by civil society and governments, and most recently, the emergence of the big human rights due diligence laws in the EU and the best ways to address child labor supply chains. I see another change from 30 years ago. Today, I never hear employers speak to me, as they were particularly happy to do 3 decades ago, about how they expressly needed children for tiny carpet nuts or small mine crevices, how it's a cultural mainstay, or a self-evident class issue, or how kids have to work with their parents because the very business people I was talking to refused to pay their parents a living wage. This tells me that on some level, the campaign to expose the brutality of child labor is in fact finally hitting home. It's at least a shift in the acceptable public dialogue and perception at this time. Those are at least requisite in any kind of debate or strengthening anti-child labor legislation. So what got us here and what will move forward? In the late 80s, early 90s, wasn't government making changes. It certainly was business. It was the forces of civil society that highlighted the issue, shamed the perpetrators, outlined a vision that offered a stronger economic and social future, and then pushed, controlled, highlighted, and embarrassed those businesses and governments for taking action. Those forces were rising ways to order economic affairs and elements and mechanisms and actions to put into practice the moral economic imperatives of their conditions. The child-free zones promoted by the Stop Child Labor movement and the child-friendly village model of global market case to the point that there's not only the symptoms of child labor, but root economic causes, and crucially, for a functioning democratic progressive society. Incorporating the experience of dignity, respect, civil engagement, and promoting citizenship and responsibility among young people through the Child Parliament Program, strengthening the village politics and nation's democratic resilience at the grassroots level. And the moment the debate on EU's next significant human rights due diligence legislation comes again from civil society, trade unions, consumer groups, and ordinary citizens. Activists in northern countries are important, but the real engine of change and impact on the ground is of course coming from the global south, where so much of the abuse by northern economic entities takes place. The success of discussing this in the EU is due to the pressure to keep momentum going. These elements, civil society, trade unions, labor, and environmental activists, need to be heeded and supported. The Global March is made up of over 50 organizations across Africa, Asia, Europe, and the Americas in dozens of countries. We see Global March members, Education International, and the International Training Federation, along with regional coordinating organizations, as a key to the efforts. Alliance 8.7 and the Pathfinder countries to meet their commitments and goals. I'll finish up quickly. Civil society organizations, trade unions need to be able to hold their governments accountable on their promises. The shrinking face of civil society across the globe is worrying. Civil society is a key catalyst for change. We need to support progress made so far, and it must continue. Global March members in Uganda, Peru, and Nepal are putting new programs as we speak to support the efforts of those Pathfinder countries. In fact, without these brave activists, we wouldn't be having this conversation today. But anyhow, it's good to hear from a number of experts and practitioners in this session regarding how to maintain momentum by a serious, practical, and aspirational effort to address forced labor, child labor, and human rights due diligence legislation. That legislation can be a model for other countries and regions to move from legislation to implementation. But this EU law may look like will be critical. Even bad law is more effective if implemented well than a great law that exists only on paper. 30 years and billions of dollars of corporate social responsibility PR exercises clearly not threat. The key now is to strengthen our voices of reform, but the mechanisms that provide at least the floor of these working conditions as outlined by the ILO, instead of preserving a Hobbesian race to the bottom, since some corporations govern simply, they're still in the 17th century. Thanks again to the organizers of this program. We really appreciate being part of the discussion. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Tim. Vous avez montré que le travail va continuer.
Thank you very much, Timothy. You demonstrated that work should go on. Besides the Pathfinder countries present in this conference, there are many others. But thank you for underlying the requirements that you underline for the European quality legislation on the due diligence in a supply chain. And I will give the floor right away to Martina Lipsch. Martina, the floor is yours.
Good morning, Mr. Good morning to your announcers. Thank you for inviting me to this important meeting and giving me the opportunity to speak from the perspective of a faith-based organization. I've been working for more than 20 years in the Catholic Church at national and international level, encouraging as many others that the issue of trafficking in human beings is taken up and comes into the agenda of the Catholic Church and church-related organizations. With the certificate of Pope Francis and his encouragement for the Catholic Church institutions and all people of goodwill to engage in the fight against human trafficking, Pope Francis called it a crime against humanity. The issue has come high on the agenda of the Catholic Church. Pope Francis, together with Anglican, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, Jewish, and Orthodox leaders, signed on 2nd December 2014 a declaration to eradicate modern slavery and human trafficking. This signals, amongst others, that fighting human trafficking needs cooperation and partnerships across geographical, organizational, religious, and conceptual barriers. We need a change of culture, and so far, I'm happy for the title of this event. We need a culture of zero tolerance, and for this, the knowledge about this crime must be mainstreamed into the whole of society. It is so very often, at least in Europe, that people think these things don't happen in our surroundings. The need for partnerships and the need to broaden the knowledge base about human trafficking is also the reason of being of the so-called Santa Marta Group, an alliance between church and police leaders to use each other's influence in society to push for a change that effectively tackles human trafficking. The German Bishops' Conference agreed to become part of this alliance. And inspired by the partnership, the Working Group Against Human Trafficking, of which I will be executive director of the German Bishops' Conference, came into being, gathering Catholic organizations in Germany engaged in the fight against human trafficking for exchange and advocacy work. We are, of course, also connected to the National Network Against Human Trafficking, the KOK. The Catholic Church and the related organizations and religious congregations have organized already in the past for the fight, networks to fight against human trafficking, like COPET, Christian Organizations Against Human Trafficking, coordinated by Caritas Internationalis, or like the network of religious sisters, Caritas. They have a global and at the same time local outreach, sometimes in parishes and communities, and can connect on departure, transit, or arrival of a person victim of human trafficking, providing each other useful information for the support of victims in a kind of transnational referral system. Moreover, spirituality and religion play an important role in the lives of many, or at least some, of the persons who are victims of trafficking. In the same spirit of cooperation, we organized recently a European one-stakeholder conference on fighting labor exploitation with participants from 17 countries, and more importantly involving different stakeholders, many of those who are around the table today as well. And I think to name a few very important is that we had the financial sector around the table. I think we have to look more into that. The judicial system, police, employers, trade unions, academia, and of course NGOs. We didn't want to leave it at our conference and be together for exchange and knowledge exchange, but it was our intention to promote a concrete commitment for fighting human trafficking. Therefore, at that conference, we proposed an action plan, and we have heard many things about action plan today. This is our action plan with so far 8 recommendations. We think that these recommendations are crucial for the eradication of human trafficking and need to be transported into action. The action plan will be revised, including some of these conclusions of the conference, and will be a living document to be added to the context. Just as a kind of little preview, and that's my conclusion of the action plan, I would like to highlight 2 recommendations that are particularly relevant for the church and church-related organizations. We would like to increase identification, and therefore we will call on church institutions like schools, hospitals, parishes, counseling centers in our area of responsibility to include education and sensitization measures on human trafficking and how to identify in the formation curricula to fight the culture of indifference. And we will further engage in the setup of networks to improve identification and provide training for relevant personnel. 2. The second recommendation recommendation, church institutions and organizations are often large buyers and consumers of goods and services. They have been vocal advocates for slavery supply chains, but have rarely checked their own supply chains. We will encourage the screening of procurement in our institutions and organizations for exploitation and human trafficking and promote responsible consumption. And finally, the action plan ends with the recommendation or better appeal that human trafficking should not pay off. And that was mentioned this morning already. If we allow the large amount of money can be earned by exploiting people, human trafficking will not stop. And on the other hand, those who want to fight it have to often fight for sufficient resources. So there's an imbalance here. Thank you as well to all who spoke about the way which I support what has been said so far. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup d'avoir respecté les horaires.
Thank you very much for sticking to your time. Now, je vais donner la parole à Karima.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. I think the organizers for organizing this foundation, the association, we work on the issue of child labor trafficking. We're not alone in the code. We have an association for 2000. We also have some partners at state level and in private sector. With regard to this problem, first, we work in preventive medicine, medical protection and rehabilitation. With regard to prevention, we work on awareness raising, silent awareness raising, meaning through all actors, schools, dropouts,
peut-être pour pas des quartiers qui sont en grande difficulté,
parce que
c'est ma fréquence. On va agir en amont. On a aussi un programme sur la sensibilisation sur les réseaux sociaux.
Working on prevention, prevent exodus of rural areas, help mothers to understand that the child is living in a street package, for example, is at risk. So it's not about to make money and bring money to the family, but this is a responsibility of parents. Protection, protecting children against all kinds of strict economic ways. How? By placing back to school, doing as much as possible for these children to attend the school during the schooling age. Today we have only one foundation managing this, and also at the education level, every month we organize up to 6 awareness raising campaigns in schools. This awareness raising is done with teachers, with experience themselves, so they understand the dangers they may encounter, and then rehabilitation. When the harm is done, that the child has been victim of trafficking or sexual exploitation. That's another area. On Marrakesh, we have 2 shelters for children. Children who don't have a home, these children are taken in shelter from 2 to 12 months. They are looked after by psychologists, and so that we also take care of the psychological side. There's also orientation needs for children to belong with a partner, and so we also launch
des centres d'apprentissage. D'abord que ces enfants-là aient envie de scolaire et qu'il y a plus de 40% ils peuvent apprendre un métier pour ne pas subir ou être utilisés dans un réseau dans la cité. Là où il y a vraiment énormément aussi à faire, c'est du capital. Est-ce que l'on peut pas créer et qui ont assez de force d'agir quand même, s'il faut passer par la justice, qu'on puisse ça peut être quelqu'un de l'avenir, peut être nous avons travaillé ensemble sur un projet avec les juges de Marrakech. Ce que je peux vous dire, c'est que celui qui a passé, il passe il y a aussi